A struggling fisherman hauled a massive catfish aboard his boat and noticed its stomach was grotesquely distended and rigid. When he sliced it open to fillet the catch, he discovered a shocking object inside that made him drop his knife and radio the authorities immediately. Drop a comment with where you're watching from today, and don't forget to subscribe to see what's coming up next. The Mississippi River doesn't borrow, it takes, and it buries its stolen goods deep in the silt where light refuses to go, hoarding the lost things of the world until a storm or a shifting current decides to spit them back out. Ray Dixon knew this truth better than anyone in Vicksburg. At 55, Ray wore the river on his face like a map of hard tributaries, his skin tanned to the color of cured tobacco and lined by decades of squinting into the glare of the muddy water. He stood on the edge of the rusted aluminum dock, staring down at the swirling brown eddies that lapped against the pylons, his boots caked in the gray clay that never seemed to wash off completely. He adjusted the brim of his faded green cap, a nervous habit he'd developed as his bank account dwindled and the fish stopped biting. The morning air hung heavy and wet, smelling of ozone and rotting driftwood, a thick blanket of humidity that promised violence before the sun went down. Ray wiped his hands on his tan work shirt, the fabric stained with oil and fish slime, and looked back at his truck. The Dixon's River Guide Service decal on the door was peeling, the S hanging on by a thread of adhesive, much like Ray's career. "You going out in this, Ray?" The voice came from the slip next to him. It was Caleb, a 20-something kid with a sparkly fiberglass base boat that looked more like a spaceship than a fishing vessel. Caleb had 3 sonar screens, a trolling motor that cost more than Ray's truck, and a client list that was fully booked. Ray didn't turn his head. He just spat into the water. "Catfish don't mind the rain, Caleb. They bite better when the barometer drops." "They're calling for hail, old man," Caleb laughed, firing up his Mercury engine, a quiet hum compared to the rattling cough of Ray's old 2-stroke. "But hey, maybe you'll catch that monster you're always talking about, the one that eats tourists." Ray watched Caleb speed off, the boat planing out instantly, leaving a wake that rocked Ray's battered, flat-bottomed John boat. Ray gritted his teeth. He needed a catch, not just a stringer of eaters, but something significant. The bank had called yesterday about the lien on the cabin. The big commercial outfits and the kids with the high-tech sonar were squeezing him out. He was a dinosaur in a world of digital anglers, a man who fished by reading the swirls on the surface rather than pixels on a screen. But Ray had a feeling today. It was a pressure behind his eyes, a prickling in the scars on his knuckles. The river was churning. The heavy rains up north a week ago were finally pushing the floodwaters down to his stretch of the Mississippi, shifting the sandbars, scouring out new holes, and waking up the giants that slept in the deep, lightless trenches. He stepped into his boat, the metal hull groaning under his weight. He didn't have GPS-locked trolling motors or side-scan imaging. He had a heavy-duty rod as thick as a pool cue, a reel the size of a coffee can spooling 80-pound test line, and a bucket of cut skipjack herring that smelled strong enough to wake the dead. Ray wasn't chasing bass. He was hunting the apex predator of the river bottom. He was heading for the Devil's Elbow. The engine sputtered to life, a cloud of blue smoke puffing into the humid air, and Ray guided the boat out into the main channel. The Devil's Elbow was a treacherous bend 5 miles upstream, where the current slammed into a limestone bluff and curled back on itself, creating a vortex of water that could suck a swimming deer under in seconds. It was a graveyard for trees, debris, and foolhardy boaters. It was also where the biggest blue catfish in the state were rumored to hold, waiting for the current to deliver their dinner. As Ray navigated the chop, the sky began to bruise, turning a sickly shade of green-black. The wind picked up, whipping the tops of the whitecaps into spray that stung his face. Most men would have turned back. Ray pushed the throttle forward. He needed to be anchored above the deep hole before the storm broke. He reached the elbow 40 minutes later. The water here was angry, boiling with hidden energy. Ray carefully maneuvered the John boat behind a massive fallen sycamore tree that broke the current, creating a small seam of calm water. He dropped his dual anchors, heavy chains welded to concrete blocks, and waited for the lines to pull tight. The boat swung in the current, locking into place. Ray baited his hook, a circle hooked the size of his palm, threading a massive chunk of oily herring onto the steel. He added an 8-ounce sinker to keep the bait down in the heavy current and cast it out. The splash was swallowed by the sound of the river. Ray placed the rod in the holder, engaged the bait clicker, and sat back on his cooler to wait. Rain began to fall, fat, cold drops that hit the aluminum boat like buckshot. Ray didn't move. He watched the rod tip. Fishing for trophy catfish was 90% boredom and 10% panic. You sat for hours, letting the scent of the bait drift downstream, creating a chum slick that would lure the fish from their caves. An hour passed. The storm intensified. Thunder rolled across the delta, vibrating in Ray's chest. The water level was rising visibly, inches every hour, the river swelling with the runoff. Then, the rod tip didn't just twitch, it bowed. It was a slow, deliberate pull, like the line had been tied to a passing barge. The rod holder groaned. Ray was on his feet in a split second, grabbing the rod just as the reel began to scream. He engaged the drag and leaned back, setting the hook. It felt like he had snagged a Volkswagen. The rod bent double, the tip nearly touching the water. Ray's boots slid on the wet aluminum floor as the weight on the other end surged downstream, peeling line off the reel with terrifying speed. "Turn! Damn you!" Ray grunted, bracing his hip against the gunnel. This wasn't a snag. Snags didn't head for the main channel. The fish was massive, using the current to its advantage, digging its head into the mud and grinding away. Ray's forearms burned as he pumped the rod, gaining a few feet of line only to lose it again as the fish made another run. The battle lasted 45 minutes. Ray was soaked to the bone, his sweat mixing with the rain. His back spasms were firing like electric shocks, but he didn't let up. He knew that if he gave this fish an inch of slack, it would roll into a snag and break the line. Slowly, agonizingly, the angle of the line changed. The fish was tiring. Ray worked it toward the surface, the heavy leader knot breaking the water. When the fish finally surfaced, Ray stopped breathing. It was a blue catfish, but it was a leviathan. Its skin was a slate-gray armor, slick and scarred. Its whiskers were as long as Ray's arm, but it was the size of the belly that made Ray freeze. The fish looked to be over 100 pounds easily, but its stomach was distended grotesquely, bulging out on both sides as if it had swallowed a basketball. The skin around the belly was tight, rigid, and misshapen. "What in the hell have you been eating?" Ray whispered, the wind stealing his words. He grabbed his net, but the fish was too big. He had to lean over the side, risking a capsize in the rough water, and grab the fish by its lower jaw with a gloved hand. He heaved, his biceps screaming, and dragged the slime-slicked monster over the gunwale. It hit the deck with a wet thud that shook the entire boat. Ray collapsed onto the bench seat, gasping for air. The fish lay there, gills heaving, its small, pale eyes fixed on nothing. It was the biggest fish Ray had ever caught in 40 years on the river. It was a state record, maybe more. It was the miracle he needed. But, as he looked at the fish, a strange unease settled over him. The belly wasn't just full, it was hard. When the fish shifted, something inside made a dull, heavy clunk, not the squelch of a partially digested carp or the crunch of a turtle shell. It sounded solid, industrial. Ray fired up the engine, leaving the anchors for another day. He needed to get off the water. The storm was now directly overhead, and lightning was forking down into the trees on the far bank. He turned the boat toward home, the massive fish lying like a gray obelisk at his feet. The ride back was a blur of rain and adrenaline. When Ray finally bumped the dock at his cabin, the sky was a bruised purple twilight. He tied off the boat and rigged a hoist to get the fish out. It bottomed out his 100-pound spring scale. It was a monster of the deep, an ancient river king. Ray dragged the fish to the cleaning station, a stainless steel table under a corrugated tin roof near his cabin. He sharpened his fillet knife, the sound of the stone against steel rhythmic and calming. He intended to clean the fish, sell the meat to the local market, which paid a premium for wild catfish, and keep the head to boil and mount. He made the first incision behind the gills, the knife slicing through the tough, leathery skin. He worked the blade down the spine, separating the massive slab of meat. The fish was old. The meat was thick and firm. Then he turned his attention to the gut cavity. He needed to dress it out. He inserted the tip of the knife into the vent and sliced upward through the belly meat. Clank. The knife hit something that stopped the blade dead. A jar of bone-deep vibration traveled up Ray's arm. Ray frowned. Catfish were garbage disposals. He'd found rocks, fishing lures, even a beer can once, but this felt different. He widened the incision, pulling back the flaps of white belly meat. The stomach was stretched to transparency, wrapped tightly around a large, mud-caked object. Ray put down the knife. He reached his gloved hands into the viscera. He could feel corners, heavy nylon webbing, a buckle. What in the world? He gripped the object and pulled. With a wet suction sound, the mass slid out of the stomach and clattered onto the metal table. It wasn't a rock. It was a heavy, tactical utility belt. It was caked in black river sludge and partially digested slime. But the shape was unmistakable. There were pouches still snapped shut. The heavy brass buckle was tarnished but intact. Ray stared at it, his heart hammering against his ribs. The fish hadn't just eaten this. This belt was heavy. It would have been attached to something, or someone. He grabbed the hose hanging nearby and sprayed the object. The pressurized water blasted away the layers of slime and mud. As the grime washed away, black nylon emerged. Then the distinct shape of a molded plastic holster, empty. And next to it, a small waterproof pelican case, the kind boaters use for keys and wallets, clipped securely to the webbing. Ray's hands trembled as he turned off the hose. The silence of the cleaning shed was deafening, broken only by the rain drumming on the tin roof. He reached for the waterproof case. It was sealed tight, the rubber gasket having done its job against the stomach acid and the river's pressure. He popped the latch. It hissed as the pressure equalized. Ray opened the lid. Sitting inside, nestled in the black foam padding, was a silver shield. It caught the overhead bulb's light, gleaming with an authority that made Ray take a step back. It was a police badge. Below the shield was a laminated ID card, preserved perfectly in the dry air of the case. The face in the photo was young, serious, with a square jaw and kind eyes. Officer Thomas Cole, Vicksburg Police Department. Ray felt the blood drain from his face. He dropped the case as if it were radioactive. The plastic clattered on the concrete floor. Everyone knew the name Thomas Cole. 5 years ago, during the great flood that breached the levees, Officer Cole had taken a patrol boat out to rescue a family stranded on a roof near the Devil's Elbow. The family was saved by a helicopter later, but Cole never made it back. His boat was never found. His body was never recovered. The river had simply swallowed him whole. The official report said he had likely capsized in the turbulent water and been washed out to the Gulf of Mexico. A tragic hero lost to the tide. Ray looked from the badge to the massive, gutted fish on the table. This catfish was a bottom feeder, a scavenger. It didn't hunt in the Gulf. It stayed in its hole in the deep river bends. If the fish had this belt, it meant the belt was in the Devil's Elbow. And if the belt was there, freshly swallowed, because the nylon showed almost no signs of acid damage, then Thomas Cole wasn't in the Gulf. He was still there, waiting. Ray didn't finish cleaning the fish. He wiped his hands on his jeans, leaving streaks of blood and slime, and ran for the cabin. He grabbed his VHF radio, his fingers slipping on the dial as he turned it to channel 16. Mayday, Mayday, this is Ray Dixon at mile marker 436. I need the sheriff. I need the game warden. I need everybody. His voice cracked, dry and terrified. I found him. I think I found Officer Cole. The flashing lights of the cruisers cut through the rainy darkness, painting Ray's cabin in strokes of frantic blue and red. Sheriff Jim Brody stepped out of his SUV, his hat pulled low against the drizzle. He was a big man, tired in the way that law enforcement officers in dying towns often are. He walked past the line of deputies who were cordoning off Ray's cleaning shed with yellow tape. Ray sat on the tailgate of his truck, smoking a cigarette with a shaking hand. "Ray?" Sheriff Brody nodded, his voice gravelly. "You want to tell me again what happened? Dispatch said you were shouting about Tom Cole." Ray flicked the cigarette into a puddle. "I didn't say I saw him, Jim. I said I found his badge. It was inside the fish." Brody sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Inside the fish. Ray, do you know how many hoaxes we get? People finding evidence, hoping for a reward or 15 minutes of fame? Look at the damn table, Jim," Ray snapped, standing up. "Go look at the fish. I cut it open an hour ago. The belt was in its stomach. The badge was in the case." Brody motioned for the medical examiner, a small woman named Dr. Harris, to go ahead. They walked into the shed. Ray followed, staying behind. The tape. Dr. Harris examined the belt. She picked up the badge with gloved hands, turning it over in the light. "It's authentic, Sheriff. Serial number matches. This is Cole's badge." Brody stared at the silver shield. The skepticism in his eyes warred with the physical evidence. "Okay, it's his badge. But Ray, that doesn't mean Cole is there. This fish," he gestured to the carcass. "These things travel miles. It could have picked this up anywhere. It could have washed down from a snag 10 miles upstream where the belt got hung up years ago. Blue cats are territorial," Ray argued, his voice rising. "Especially the big ones. They find a hole, a deep structure, and they own it. That fish came from the Devil's Elbow. I fought it there. It didn't swim from Memphis with a 10-pound belt in its gut." "The Devil's Elbow was dragged 5 years ago, Ray," Brody said dismissively. "We ran sonar. We had divers. There was nothing there, just trees and mud. "You dragged the main channel," Ray countered. "You didn't check the undercut beneath the bluff. You couldn't get your fancy boats in there without risking the props. But that's where the debris settles. That's where the fish was." Brody turned away, dismissing him. "We'll take the badge, Ray. We'll log it. We'll reopen the file. But I'm not authorizing a dive team into the Devil's Elbow based on the stomach contents of a catfish. It's too dangerous and the budget is gone. It's 1,000,000 to 1 shot that the body is actually there." "So you're just going to leave him?" Ray asked, incredulous. "We're going to investigate," Brody said, using the cop word that meant doing nothing. "Go inside, Ray. Get some sleep." Ray watched them bag the belt and the badge. He watched them take photos of the fish. Then they left, the taillights fading into the wet night, leaving Ray alone with the sound of the river and the ghost of a man he'd never met. He couldn't sleep. He sat on his porch, watching the rain hammer the river. He knew what he knew. The belt was fresh. The fish hadn't digested it yet. That meant the belt had been buried, protected, and something, the recent flood, had dislodged it. "Mr. Dixon?" The voice was soft, barely audible over the rain. Ray jumped, reaching for the flashlight on the table. He clicked it on, the beam cutting through the dark. Standing at the edge of his porch steps was a young woman. She looked to be in her early 20s. She was soaking wet, her hair plastered to her face, shivering in a thin raincoat. But her eyes were steady. "I'm Sarah," she said. "Sarah Cole." Ray lowered the light. "I know who you are, miss. You look just like him." She stepped onto the porch, out of the rain. "I heard the scanner. I have a radio at the house. I heard you tell the sheriff about the elbow." Ray sighed, pulling out a chair for her. "The sheriff thinks I'm a crazy old fisherman." "I know what the sheriff thinks," Sarah said, sitting down, her hands clasping her knees to stop the shaking. "He thinks my dad drowned and washed away. He thinks there's nothing to find. But you sounded sure." "I am sure," Ray said, leaning against the railing. "That fish was a localized feeder. It lived in the deep scour hole at the elbow. If it ate that belt, it's because the belt just came loose from the mud right there." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed but fierce. "My dad was a good swimmer. He was a Navy vet before he was a cop. I never believed he just vanished. He would have fought. He would have stayed with the boat." "If the boat is there, he's there," Ray said gently. "Will you take me?" The question hung in the humid air. Ray looked at her. "Miss, the river's at flood stage. It's dangerous. The sheriff—" "To hell with the sheriff," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "He stopped looking 4 years ago. You found him. You found a piece of him. Please, I have to know. I can't go another 5 years wondering if he's in the Gulf or if he's right here." Ray looked at his boat tied to the dock. It was battered. He was tired. He was broke. Helping her wouldn't pay his mortgage. It might even get his license pulled if Brody found out he took a civilian into a flood zone. But then he looked at Sarah's hands. She was twisting a silver ring on her finger. He realized it was a mourning ring. Ray Dixon had spent his life taken from the river. Fish, drift logs, peace of mind. Maybe it was time to give something back. "Be here at first light," Ray said. "Wear boots and don't tell the sheriff." The dawn broke gray and violent. The storm had passed, but the wind remained, and the river was a swollen, angry beast churning with brown foam. Sarah was waiting on the dock when Ray came out with 2 thermoses of coffee. She was wearing waders and a heavy jacket. She looked terrified of the water, but she climbed into the John boat without hesitation. "We're going to need to be careful," Ray shouted over the roar of the engine as they pushed off. "The current at the elbow is going to be ripping at about 10 knots. If we go overboard, we don't come back up." Sarah nodded, gripping the gunwale until her knuckles were white. The trip upstream was a fight. The river threw logs and debris at them, the engine whining as Ray dodged obstacles that would have punched a hole in the aluminum hull. He read the water like a language. The V-shaped ripples that meant a submerged rock, the slick boils that indicated an updraft. When they reached the Devil's Elbow, the scene was chaotic. The water was swirling in a massive, counterclockwise eddy, trapping huge tree trunks in a slow, grinding dance. "There." Ray pointed to a spot near the limestone bluff where the water seemed to dip. "That's the scour hole. It's 60 feet deep. The current hits the wall and dives down. If the boat sank, the mud would have buried it there. The flood last week must have shifted the silt and exposed it." Ray killed the big engine and lowered his trolling motor, fighting to hold the boat steady in the swirl. He turned on his sonar, an old monochrome unit that looked like an Atari screen compared to Caleb's tech. "Watch the screen," Ray instructed Sarah. They drifted over the hole. The screen showed the jagged bottom, the noise of the silt. Nothing distinct. "Again," Ray said. They made 4 passes. Nothing. The doubt started to creep into Ray's chest. Had he dragged this girl out here for nothing? Was Brody right? "Mr. Dixon," Sarah said, pointing at the water, "what is that?" Ray looked. A massive boil of bubbles was rising to the surface about 20 yards off the bow. "Methane," Ray said, "from rotten vegetation on the bottom. Something shifted down there." He maneuvered the boat over the bubbles. He grabbed his heavy grappling hook, a 3-pronged steel claw on a coil of thick rope. "I'm going to drag," Ray said. "Hold the tiller. Keep us pointed upstream." He threw the hook. It sank, pulling rope rapidly into the murky dark. When it hit bottom, Ray began to drift, letting the hook drag through the mud. He felt the vibration in the rope. Mud, rock, log, mud. Then, clunk. The rope went tight instantly. The boat jerked, spinning around in the current. "Snag!" Ray yelled. "Reverse!" Sarah twisted the throttle. The engine roared, fighting the current to give Ray slack. Ray pulled on the rope. It was solid, unmoving, but it didn't feel like wood. When a hook hits a log, it digs in soft. When it hits rock, it scrapes. This felt dead, metallic. "I'm hooked on something hard," Ray grunted, wrapping the rope around the cleat. "Drive forward. Let's see if we can lift it or break it loose." Sarah gunned the engine. The rope sang, tight as a guitar string. The boat dipped low in the water. "It's not moving," Sarah yelled. Ray put his hand on the rope. He could feel the water rushing over whatever he had hooked down there, and then he felt a harmonic vibration. A hum. "Kill the engine," Ray ordered. Silence fell, save for the rushing water. "It's not a tree," Ray said, his voice trembling. "It's metal. I can feel the current singing on the edges. Trees don't sing." He looked at Sarah. "We need the sheriff. Now." It took Ray 2 hours of arguing on the radio, threatening to go to the state news stations, before Sheriff Brody dispatched the dive team. The presence of the badge, combined with Ray's insistence that he had snagged a metal structure in the exact location of the disappearance, finally forced their hand. By noon, the Devil's Elbow was a parking lot of boats. The sheriff's patrol boat, a dive barge, and the game warden were all anchored in the eddy. Ray and Sarah sat in the John boat, watching from the perimeter. "You think it's him?" Sarah asked, her voice small. "I know it is," Ray said. The lead diver, a man named Miller, surfaced after 20 minutes. He climbed onto the barge, removing his regulator. He looked pale. He walked straight to Sheriff Brody. Ray saw Brody's shoulders slump. The sheriff took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. He looked over the water, directly at Ray and Sarah. He nodded. It was the nod, the one that ends hope but begins closure. Sarah let out a sound that wasn't quite a sob. It was a release of breath she had been holding for 5 years. She buried her face in her hands. Ray reached out and awkwardly patted her shoulder, his rough, calloused hand resting gently on her jacket. It took 3 hours to rig the lift bags. The crane on the barge groaned as it began to winch the cable. Slowly, bubbling and churning, the shape broke the surface. It was a boat, or what was left of one. The hull was dented and stripped of paint, covered in river slime and mussels. But on the side, barely visible through the grime, was the faded decal. Police. And inside the cabin, visible through the shattered glass, was the shadow of a man. He was still strapped into the pilot's seat. Silence fell over the river. The deputies on the barge took off their hats. Even the wind seemed to die down. As the barge crew worked to secure the wreck, Sheriff Brody motored over to Ray's boat. He looked different now. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a somber respect. "You were right, Ray," Brody said quietly. "He was there the whole time." "What happened?" Sarah asked, her voice steady now. "Why didn't he get out?" Brody looked at the young woman. "The divers. They saw something. The throttle." "The throttle?" "It was jammed forward," Brody said, "and the steering wheel was locked hard to starboard. The boat was wedged into a massive pile of underwater timber." Sarah looked confused. Ray understood immediately. "The family," Ray said. "The one he saved." Brody nodded. The report said the family was on a roof that was about to collapse into the current. Cole couldn't get the boat close enough because of the debris. It looks like he rammed the debris pile on purpose. He jammed the boat in there to create a bridge, a steady platform for them to climb across to the tree line where the chopper got them. But doing that pinned his boat. When the current shifted, it rolled the boat over and took him down with it. Sarah covered her mouth. "He didn't crash." "No," Ray said, looking at the wreck. "He anchored himself. He traded his boat and his life to make sure those people had a path to safety. It wasn't an accident. It was a sacrifice." The realization washed over them. Officer Cole hadn't been a victim of the river. He had beaten it. He had outsmarted the current long enough to save the lives entrusted to him, even if it cost him his own. The funeral was held 3 days later. It was the biggest Vicksburg had seen in a decade. The streets were lined with people. Police officers from 3 states came to pay respects. Ray stood at the back of the cemetery, dressed in his only suit, a charcoal one that smelled faintly of mothballs. He felt out of place among the crisp uniforms and the weeping family members. He turned to leave before the service ended, not wanting to intrude. "Mr. Dixon." He stopped. Sarah was walking toward him across the grass. She looked tired, but the haunted look in her eyes was gone. She was holding something. "I wanted you to have this," she said. She handed him a small, framed photo. It was a picture of the river at sunset, taken from the bluff above the Devil's Elbow. And tucked into the frame was a small fishing lure, an old, beat-up jitterbug. "It was in his tackle box at home," she said. "He loved fishing almost as much as he loved the job. He would have wanted the man who brought him home to have it." Ray took the photo, his throat tight. I didn't do it for a reward, Sarah. You gave us the truth, she said. You gave us him back. There's no reward big enough for that. But the department posted the reward money anyway. It's deposited in your account. Sheriff Brody made sure of it. Ray looked at her, stunned. The reward for information leading to the recovery was $25,000. It was enough to pay off the lien, enough to fix the engine, enough to breathe. Thank you, Ray whispered. Don't thank me, she said, kissing him on the cheek. Thank the Catfish. Ray walked back to his truck. He drove down to the river, parking in his usual spot. The sun was setting, painting the water in hues of gold and blood orange. The river looked peaceful today, deceivingly calm. He walked down to the dock. His John boat was there, bumping gently against the tires. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Ray pulled it out. It was a number he didn't recognize. Dixon's Guide Service, he answered. Is this Ray Dixon? A voice asked. The man who found Officer Cole. Yes, Ray said. I'm calling from St. Louis. My buddies and we've been reading about you. We want to book a trip. We don't want the fancy boats. We want the guy who knows the river. We want the guy who knows where the monsters are. Ray looked out at the water. He watched a swirl of current move past the piling. I can do that, Ray said, a smile cracking his weathered face for the first time in years. But bring your rain gear. The river decides when we come home. He hung up and tipped his cap to the dark water. The Mississippi had taken a good man, but it had finally given him back, and in doing so, it had given Ray back to himself. Ray started the engine. It caught on the first pull, a strong, steady idle that sounded like a heartbeat. He cast off the lines and turned the bow upstream into the current, ready to see what else. The river was hiding in the dark.